What is the role of business in responding to President Biden's executive order to strengthen critical U.S. supply chains? We get answers today from Benjamin Ruddell. He is professor in the School of Informatics, Computing, and Cyber Systems at Northern Arizona University. Hello, Ben. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Bob. How are you?
Good. So I want to talk about the implications of this executive order from President Biden, especially with regard to the roles of the private and public sector in carrying it out. First of all, where do we need government regulation to make this work?
I would say we clearly do need government regulation based on the events of the past couple of years. There's a crisis that we're still in the middle of, which is the COVID-19 crisis that has been the latest of several issues that have come up. Other issues that have come up is China's role in critical supply chains. We started to realize a few years ago that China is beginning to sell us telecommunications gear, also selling pharmaceuticals in the supply chain. And then we discovered that a lot of our personal protective gear now comes from China instead of places it used to come from, like Texas. So because of that, and because of problems that have appeared in the supply chain during emergencies, I believe there is a strong need for government regulation in this space. And you'll see, if you look at my press releases and comments on the web from early in the COVID-19 crisis, I was already calling for a critical supply chain regulation at the federal level and predicting that that would be a natural outcome. I didn't expect it to come so soon, though. I didn't expect it to be one of the first actions of the Biden administration. That surprises me. It means it's a real priority now.
I think a lot of people were surprised as well. But what form would the regulation take? Would it be toward the end of ensuring a greater domestic supply of PPE, or would it be something else? What exactly would it do?
Yeah, so my understanding of this executive order is that it's broadly intentioned, although I think I read some language in there about microelectronics or microprocessors as one of the immediate issues of concern. There's a shortage of microprocessors right now as well.
Yeah.
So I think that I think the intent is fairly broad, though, of this executive order. And the question of what federal regulation should look like, I think, is really now the question of the day, because it looks like we're heading down that path. I can tell you my perspective on this, and it's based on my work in the area. So first, yes, we do need federal regulation, because regulation sets safeguards and guardrails on the free enterprise market system. The supply chains of companies are without regulation and in the absence of crisis, they are going to get leaned and slimmed down to a point of maximum cost efficiency. And that is not the same system state as one that will give us a resilient or secure supply chain. There's actually a trade-off in some cases between resilience or reliability in a supply chain versus its cost effectiveness. So this is a classic case where, in the absence of some kind of regulation to ensure the reliability and resilience of the supply chain and some degree of domestic self-sufficiency, you're going to see corporate supply chains going to the low-cost bidder. Often that's China, often that's overseas suppliers, and often the public is left holding the bag. So I do think we need this. One of the defining attributes of a critical supply chain is that it's critical for life and it's critical for our security. So these aren't luxury items. These are items that people are going to die without.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so I think that regulation is more important in this space. Now, what shouldn't the private
Next
sector
question,
or the government
yes.
sector do?
Mm-hmm.
I'm on the record from March of 2020 pointing out that the grocery sector or the food sector of the U.S. economy, which is a critical lifeline supply chain, is proving at that time, a year ago, in the midst of the crisis, to be incredibly resilient. And the reason for that is the private sector's agility, its ability to pivot and to adapt during the crisis. We saw, as evidence of that agility and resilience, the food sector pivoted from being roughly 50-50 restaurant and grocery store distribution to almost 100% grocery store distribution. And that pivot happened in a matter of weeks. It was amazing. Several 100 million people, and half of that food started moving through different distribution channels in just weeks.
Mhm.
That's incredible resilience and adaptability. So what we need to avoid doing when we regulate the supply chain is putting handcuffs on the ability of the private sector to adapt and respond during emergencies. And I think that the private sector is really the best situated to decide how to implement a secure and resilient supply chain.
Mhm.
They may need the incentives to force them to prioritize resilience and self-sufficiency in the supply chain, but they know best how to do it once the regulations are in place. So I would hate to see a system of regulation at the federal level that controlled the how. I think the policies at the federal level should set the goals and provide the incentives and the rules and the punishments, but leave the private sector to establish the how. Because if you start telling them exactly who they should buy from, or making them go through permitting processes to change who they buy from, something like that, that's just going to slow things down and destroy that resilience and that agility during a disaster, right? So
Yeah,
let's not
not
do
being
that.
told where to buy stuff from, then you don't think that will result necessarily in companies going strictly for the low cost option, which in this case is often China. You think that the private sector does have the awareness and the foresight to vary their supply without the government telling them to?
I think, well, there's a middle ground here. I think that what we need is maybe some rules on minimum fractions of sourcing that are domestic and that come from friendly allied nations, which is different from sourcing to just anyone. I think that might be necessary. We might need to see auditing to verify that people are following the rules, but I don't want to see anything prescriptive that says you have to buy from this country, you have to buy from that country, or this supplier or that supplier. And in particular, I would hate to see permitting that went into individual purchasing decisions. That would be incredibly inefficient and would slow things down.
Yeah. What do you think about the possible role of the federal government in establishing a strategic reserve of critical supplies, much along the lines of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve?
Yeah, I actually think that's a good idea as part of a balanced strategy. Let me explain what I mean. And let me give you an example. So after the last pandemic flu, this was our last near pandemic or near miss with a big global scale pandemic. There was such a stockpile established of personal protective equipment. And there was also a large facility funded in Fort Worth, Texas to produce masks. This is my understanding. That's secondhand information, but I saw this on the news. And then it wasn't funded and maintained. And so there was even a recognition after the last pandemic, not this one, that we needed medical stockpiles that were large and domestic capacity, and that there was a need for federal funding. I guess that Congress just never wrote the check to actually continue that work. So do we need stockpiles of all kinds of critical goods? Yes, we do. We need strategic reserves. If it's critical, you need strategic reserves. So components for the power grid need to be stockpiled. Food needs to be stockpiled. It is. There are grain reserves. There's cold storage, meat reserves. Definitely fuel. We do have some of those already. And then there's other things as well. Some kinds of telecommunications gear. We need to have
basic things like masks and gowns and stuff like that, ventilators and the like.
Yes.
Yeah.
If it's critical, now what's critical? We can argue about this. There's going to be people, as soon as this happens, there's going to be people arguing that everything is critical. And it's not. Things are critical if they are necessary for short-term survival and maintenance of human life. That's what makes them critical. And most things don't fit that category. But anything that's critical, we do need stockpiles. But that's part of a balanced strategy. Okay, so actually stockpiles aren't enough, because if you become, the key to resilience in a supply chain is that you maintain options. right? Flexibility and options that gives you the capacity to adapt. Stockpiles are a great option. They're one source that you can tap in a pinch when things go wrong. But if stockpiles are our only option, that actually destroys resilience, right? And so the key to making a resilient supply chain is to have a diversity of suppliers, not just one or two. You need to have buff inventory. Inventory is a kind of stockpile, right? You have inventory, you need to have strategic stockpiles, you need to have multiple suppliers, and you need to have stockpiles and suppliers in different locations. You need to have some that are domestic, you need to have some that are in other countries, especially if they're friendly countries. And that diversity of sources is what provides the options. As soon as you start whittling those back to single suppliers or small numbers of suppliers or sources that dominate the storage or production, you lose resilience.
Yeah. To the extent that companies did restrict their supply chains to single suppliers and practice extremely lean inventory strategies, do you believe that this particular disruption, this particular pandemic has taught them some lessons and that going forward, they might embrace the types of solutions that you're talking about at the private sector level?
I sure hope so. Although I don't think this is a lack of knowledge in this situation. We have a lot of smart people out there running supply chains and purchasing, and they knew about this issue with resilience and with needing options for suppliers before. But I think that the competitive marketplace that they're working in has forced them into extremely lean operations and just in time. And I think that is a market structure that needs to be remedied through federal regulation. I think if we require everybody to compete on the same playing field and we set some minimums in terms of diversity and resilience and inventory and sourcing decisions, then that will set some resilience targets and floors for the market. And then everybody's competing on the same playing field. It's just that drive for cost efficiency that has hurt resilience in order to achieve the lowest cost.
Well, we can only hope that this particular crisis has led both the private sector and government to rethink their policies going forward, perhaps to create a more resilient supply chain of critical supplies. But Ben Ruddell of Northern Arizona University, thanks so much for bringing some clarity to this issue and helping us to understand the respective roles of business and government in this manner. Thanks very much for being with me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob.